Idiot. Only an idiot of a man would dare feed a homeless woman and still believe he could go home and sleep peacefully with his daughter. Mike Carter did exactly that. And a few weeks later, the Hayes family's lawyer knocked on his door at midnight, not to say thank you, but to declare that his name was now listed in an inheritance file. Sounds like winning the lottery? No, that was when his daughter started being followed, when someone texted, "the kid first," when an explosion went off, not to kill him, just to force him to run like an animal cornered. But just seconds later, in one single moment, the truth flipped completely. That homeless woman was not dead. She used a fake death to trigger the law, used Mike as bait, used a child as leverage, and then even she lost control of the monster she had just unleashed. So, who is the real villain? The Hayes family, who use money and power to hunt people down? The woman who believed she was manipulating the system? Or Mike himself, who unknowingly put his child in the crosshairs because of one act of kindness? If you were Mike, would you dare open the door? Would you hand that woman over to save your child? Or would you stay silent and live on with a memory that would follow your child for the rest of their life? If this story made you uncomfortable, angry, or forced you to ask yourself what you would do in that situation, leave your thoughts in the comments below and hit subscribe now, because stories like this are not for casual viewers. American suburbs in the rainy season always carry a sense of calm that is easy to mistake. Front lawns are trimmed short to the same height. White wooden fences line up straight, as if pre-measured. Streetlights turn on evenly just as darkness falls. Everything looks so uniform that people can believe this place is immune to disturbance. Houses close early after dinner, curtains drawn tight, lights spilling out just warm enough. At the end of such a street, Mike lives with his daughter Emma, in an old house that was there even before he moved in. The house is not big, not new, but enough for the two of them to get through ordinary days. Mike's life is held together by routine. He wakes up early, makes coffee, prepares breakfast, takes Emma to school, and then goes to work. In the afternoon, he picks her up, stops by the familiar grocery store, and gets home before it is fully dark. Bills are paid on time, and meals are simple but filling. Mike believes in that order. He believes that as long as small things happen in the right sequence, nothing will suddenly collapse. After his wife died, that was the only way he knew to keep the house standing. That afternoon, the rain came earlier than usual. The sky turned gray from mid-afternoon, rain falling in thin but persistent layers, enough to make the road shine under newly lit lamps. Mike pulled his jacket collar higher as the two of them left the park to head home. He glanced at his watch, his voice low but urgent. "Hurry up, Emma. Let's get home before it gets worse." Emma quickened her steps behind him, her small shoes leaving thin trails of water on the path. As they passed the large oak tree at the edge of the park, Emma slowed down. Under the tree, a woman sat, curled up. Her coat was thin and wet, her hair stuck to her forehead, her shoulders pulled in tight as if trying to keep a bit of warmth. She held her stomach, her back slightly hunched, her figure smaller than the people passing around her. Her eyes did not lift to search for pity. They quietly followed the food bags in other people's hands as they walked past. Emma tugged lightly at her father's jacket, her voice small but clear. "Dad, she's cold." Mike paused for a very brief beat. He saw the trembling hands, saw the thin breath in the cold air. He answered shortly, without turning around. "Look, but don't get close." His voice carried no irritation, only the habit of keeping distance that he had practiced for a long time. They took a few more steps. Mike heard the steady rain on their hoods, heard Emma's light breathing behind him. A normal evening was waiting for them at home. He thought of a simple dinner, of checking homework, of the familiar chair in the living room. The feeling came quickly, not because of the woman's eyes, but because of the cold rain and the thought that a small act could neatly resolve what was in front of him. Mike turned back toward the small food stand near the park entrance. Warm, yellow light spilled from inside, the smell of food spreading through the damp air. He ordered a hot meal, paid, and nodded when the vendor handed over the receipt. There was no conversation, no explanation. He carried the food box back and placed it in the woman's hands. "Eat, don't stay here anymore." The words were short, firm, more like a necessary instruction than comfort. The woman flinched when she felt the warmth through the paper. She gripped the box tightly, lowered her head further. Her voice was very soft, as if afraid of being heard. "You don't know what you just did." Mike had already turned away before hearing the full sentence. He did not stop, did not look back. Standing there, even one more second, would make things longer than he wanted. The two of them continued toward the parking lot. Rain made the streetlights reflect in streaks across the pavement. As he led Emma across the road, Mike briefly noticed a dark-colored sedan parked in the lot on the other side. The lights were off, but the engine was still running. It sat there longer than necessary, long enough to catch the eye. Mike glanced at it, then looked away. In this area, unfamiliar cars were not unusual. He said nothing to Emma, only held her hand a little tighter. When they got home, Mike locked the door, hung their wet coats on the hook. Rain continued to fall, tapping the awning in familiar rhythms. Emma placed her shoes in the corner, but her eyes were still turned toward the window. "Why do you keep looking outside?" Mike stood by the door a moment longer, then turned back. "Nothing. It's just rain makes it hard to sleep." Emma nodded, did not ask more. She was used to answers like that, enough to close a conversation. Dinner passed quietly. Mike asked Emma about school, listened as she talked about a new drawing, and about what the teacher had praised. He nodded, smiled at the right moments. But sometimes his gaze drifted, settling on the window where the rain still fell steadily. The image of the sedan in the parking lot flickered through his mind, then faded. He told himself he was thinking too much. Night fell, and the house sank into silence. Mike lay in bed, listening to the rain outside. He shifted a few times, then let his body sink into familiar fatigue. In the next room, Emma slept peacefully, her breathing even, her arms wrapped around her pillow. At 2:13 a.m., the doorbell camera lit up. There was no ring, no knock. Under the streetlight, a figure stood still, wearing dark clothing, face swallowed by shadow. The person lifted their head, gaze fixed directly at Emma's bedroom window. Rain fell in front of the lens, making the image slightly distorted, but the posture did not change. A few seconds passed. The figure turned away, stepped out of the light, blending into the empty street. The streetlight remained on. The rain continued to fall. In the bedroom, Emma shifted, pulling the blanket higher over her shoulders. The nightlight cast a soft glow on the curtains, motionless. The days that followed passed more slowly than Mike expected. The rain kept falling steadily. The suburbs kept their familiar order, as if the night with a figure standing under a streetlight was just a minor disturbance, not worth remembering. Mike continued his old routine, taking Emma to school, going to work, and coming home on time. He did not bring up the incident at the park again, nor did not ask Emma whether she still remembered the woman from that day. In his mind, it was a small act that ended the moment he turned his back and walked away. But his body began to react before his reason could name anything. He found himself looking out the window longer than usual, checking the door locks twice before going to bed. There were very brief moments, while standing in the kitchen or driving, when he suddenly felt as if he had missed an important detail. Then work pulled him along. Tasks dragged him back into reality, and the feeling faded. A few nights later, when the house lights were off and Emma was asleep in the next room, a knock sounded at the door. It was not a polite knock, nor a frantic one. It was firm, steady, strong enough to cut through the quiet of the neighborhood. Mike sprang up from the sofa, his heart beating a notch faster. He glanced at the clock. It was past 9. No one in this area knocked on doors at that hour unless it was necessary. He walked to the door and glanced through the small window. Under the porch light, two men stood side by side, dark suits, straight posture, leather briefcases in hand. When Mike opened the door, one of them looked straight into his eyes, his voice flat and cold. "Mike Carter?" Mike nodded, barely having time to speak before the man continued. "We need you to sign to confirm receipt of a notice." Mike frowned. "What notice?" The man did not answer right away. He opened his briefcase, took out a neatly clipped stack of papers, and held it out toward Mike. Mike looked down, his eyes skimming the bold printed words, "Deceased, Trust, Beneficiary." He let out a short laugh, almost reflexively. "You've got the wrong house." The other man stepped forward half a pace and placed a thick envelope on the door rail. "No, we have sufficient information, including your daughter's name." Mike looked up, his gaze hardening. In that moment, Emma appeared behind him, just enough to see the two strangers. She whispered, her voice full of uncertainty, "Dad, who are they?" Mike immediately pulled her back, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Go inside." His voice dropped, allowing no argument. He turned back to the two men. "I'm not signing anything. The first man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. You don't have to sign now. This is an official notice. You have the right to consult a lawyer. He pushed the envelope closer. We're just following procedure. Mike stared at the papers for a few more seconds, then took them, saying nothing more. The two men turned and walked away, their shoes striking the wet steps evenly, leaving the porch empty. The door closed. Mike stood still for a moment, the envelope in his hand feeling heavier than its weight. Emma stood beside him, her eyes anxious. Dad? Mike took a breath, his voice returning to normal. It's nothing, just a paperwork mix-up. He led Emma back to her room, waited until she lay down, then turned off the light. When he returned to the living room, he placed the envelope on the table and looked at it as if it were a foreign object brought into the house. That night, Mike did not sleep deeply. The printed words surfaced every time he closed his eyes. Deceased, trust, beneficiary. He did not need to open the envelope to know what it was about. The image of the woman in the park flickered through his mind, then he pushed it away. Impossible. No connection. He told himself that over and over, until exhaustion pulled him into shallow sleep. The next morning, Mike woke earlier than usual. He made coffee, opened his phone out of habit to check his account before work. The screen loaded for a few seconds, then showed a new number. A sum of money from a trust fund had been transferred into his account. Not the full amount, but large enough to make him freeze. His hand went cold, and the coffee in the mug sloshed as he set it down hard on the table. Mike sat down in the chair, staring at the screen. The number did not bring relief or luck. It felt like a marker, a red line just drawn through his name. He heard Emma calling from the bedroom, quickly locked the screen, stood up, and answered as if nothing had happened. I'm here. After taking Emma to school, Mike returned home and opened the envelope again. He flipped through each page, reading slowly. Everything was laid out clearly, precisely, leaving no room for error. The woman's name appeared in the file, matching the name he had read in one corner of the paper. He recalled the gaunt face under the tree, the trembling hands holding the food box. Mike took the business card from the envelope and called the number printed on it. After a few rings, a middle-aged male voice answered. Mike gave his name, spoke quickly about the money and the trust. The other end went silent for a moment, then the voice responded evenly. You are the legal beneficiary. Any questions you should discuss with your lawyer. I don't know who that person is, Mike said, trying to keep his voice steady. That's not our concern, the voice replied, and the call ended. Mike set the phone down and stared into the space in front of him. The unease from the past days now had a concrete shape. He opened his computer and typed the woman's name into the search bar. The results appeared scattered. An old article mentioned her presence at charity events of the Hayes real estate family. Distant photos, evening gowns, flashlights. Another forum was filled with comments claiming she had been cut off from the family long ago, that her name no longer appeared in official records. Mike read, turned pages, and the more he read, the more confused he became. Each piece of information felt like a fragment, but none fit cleanly. Who are you, really? Mike muttered, his voice hoarse. He closed the computer and walked to the window. Outside, the street was still quiet. Houses remained closed, traffic sparse. He told himself he needed more time, needed a lawyer, needed a reasonable explanation, but deep down, he knew this had gone beyond what could be explained by an administrative error. In the afternoon, when Mike looked up from his computer screen, his gaze drifted instinctively toward the end of the street. The dark-colored sedan appeared again, parked closer to the curb than before. The lights were off. No one stepped out. It sat there, as if waiting. Mike stood still, one hand on the window ledge, a chill running along his spine. He did not call Emma to look, did not step outside. He only watched until the sky darkened further and the streetlights came on, clearly outlining the car in the rain. The sedan did not leave. That noon dragged on more slowly than usual. Mike sat at his desk, but his mind no longer stayed on the numbers and emails in front of him. The image of the sedan parked at the end of the street last night kept returning, fixed in some corner of his thoughts. He told himself he was overreacting. This suburb was quiet. Strange things usually had simpler explanations than people imagined. He reached for his now cold coffee, just as his phone vibrated. The screen showed an unknown number. Mike hesitated for half a second, then answered, "Hello?" On the other end, there was no greeting, only a hurried breath, heavy and close to his ear. Mike frowned, his back straightening. Then a voice came through, very low, very fast, as if afraid of being heard. Don't accept. Don't go home. Mike jumped up from his chair, the chair sliding lightly across the floor. Who are you? Where are you? He asked quickly, his voice tightening. There was a brief pause on the line, then the woman's voice turned hoarse. I don't have much time. The call cut off abruptly, leaving a short beep and an uncomfortable emptiness in Mike's ear. He stood still in the middle of the office, the phone pressed to his ear for a few more seconds, as if waiting for the signal to return. Nothing. His heart beat faster, and the hand holding the phone began to sweat. Mike looked around the office, and everyone else was still working as usual, talking quietly, as if nothing had just happened. He sat back down, but could not focus. The words repeated in his head, don't accept, don't go home. It did not sound like advice, it sounded like a warning. Mike left work earlier than usual. On the way back, he did not drive straight to Emma's school. Instead, he turned onto his own street, slowing as the car approached. The house was still there, the fence still closed, the trash bin placed where it always was, but something kept him from driving past, like every other day. Mike stopped the car, stepped out, and stood looking for a long moment. He walked around the front yard, his eyes scanning every detail. The living room window was shut, the curtains drawn as usual. The trash bin sat close to the fence, its lid slightly off, as if it had been lifted and set back down. Mike bent to look at the wet ground near the walkway. There were no clear signs, but there was the feeling that someone had stood here and refused to leave. He moved to the side of the house, touched the wooden fence, and peered through the gap toward the back. Everything was still, too still. Mike returned to the car and drove straight to Emma's school. When she got in, he tried to keep his voice normal. How was school today? Emma answered with a few short sentences, talking about a test and a new classmate. Mike nodded, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. He said nothing about the phone call, did not ask Emma if she had noticed anything strange around the house. He did not yet know where to begin. By the time they got home, the afternoon was fading. Mike opened the doorbell camera app on his phone and scrolled through the footage. One frame made him stop. Under last night's streetlight, a man wearing a cap stood at the edge of the porch. He did not step forward, did not reach for the bell. He simply stood there, head tilted up, staring directly at Emma's bedroom window. Mike replayed the clip several times, his stomach tightening. No action crossed a clear line, but the gaze was unmistakable. Mike called the police. When they arrived, 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car and glanced around the quiet street. Mike showed them the video, pointed out where the man had stood. One of them leaned in to look at the screen and nodded slightly. Do you have any enemies? He asked carefully. Mike shook his head, answering slowly. I just work and raise my kid. The other officer looked around, wrote a few notes, then said they would log the report and increase patrols in the area. There was no basis to detain anyone, nothing specific enough to do more. The patrol car drove away, red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement before disappearing at the end of the street. Mike stood on the porch, a hollow feeling rising in him. He closed the door, locked it, and checked the bolt twice. Emma looked at him, her voice low. Dad, what's going on? Mike rubbed her head. Nothing. I just want to make sure everything's okay. Less than 10 minutes after the police car vanished, Mike's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Just 2 words. Give it back. Mike read it, his heart jumping. Another message arrived immediately after. You don't belong to the Hayes house. Mike swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the phone. Before he could react, the screen lit up again. 20 seconds later, a 3rd message appeared. The girl first. Mike felt blood rush to his head. He squeezed the phone until his knuckles turned white. His voice came out very small, almost soundless. Don't mention my daughter. Emma stood a few steps away, seeing her father's expression change. Dad? Mike turned immediately, forcing his voice steady. Nothing. Go to your room and do your homework. The evening passed under compressed tension. Mike sat beside Emma as she did her homework, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. Every passing car made his shoulders tense. He checked the locks once more before bed, turned on the camera app, leaving the screen lit beside him. Night fell, and the rain started again. Near midnight, a sharp sound came from the street, tires screeching on wet asphalt. Mike jumped up and moved quickly to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out. The black sedan was making a sharp turn at the end of the street, its wheels slipping just enough to expose part of the license plate before it sped off into the rain. Mike strained to follow it, to memorize the two characters that flashed under the streetlight. Then, the car was gone. He stood by the window for a long time, rain falling steadily outside, the street returning to its familiar quiet. But this time, Mike no longer believed in that quiet. The next morning came too quickly. Mike barely slept, only drifting off in short stretches before waking at the slightest sound. When the sky had just begun to lighten, he got up and went to the front door out of old habit, as if everything were still in its proper order. The door opened, cold air, and the damp smell of rain rushing in. The newspaper sat crooked in the mailbox, the edge of the paper sticking out, the lid no longer fitting the way it usually did. Mike stopped, stared for a few seconds, then bent down and pulled the paper out. The mailbox had a faint scratch along the edge, as if someone had slipped a hand inside, taken something out, then put it back hastily. Mike lifted his head and looked around the still empty street. "Is anyone there?" he called out, louder than necessary. His voice carried and then died away. There was no reply, no movement except a car moving slowly at the far end of the street. Mike stood there a few more seconds, then closed the mailbox and carried the newspaper inside. In the kitchen, Emma was still asleep. Mike set the paper on the table without opening it, the familiar feeling that a boundary had just been crossed settling in. As he turned back toward the door to lock it, the neighbor from the house next door walked by with his dog. The man stopped, glanced at Mike, then quickly looked toward the end of the street. He loosened the leash slightly and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Last night, I saw that car make a sharp turn." Mike turned immediately. "What car?" The neighbor dug into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "The black sedan. I only managed to write down these two characters before it sped off." Mike took the paper. Two characters scribbled in a ballpoint pen, the ink smudged from moisture. He stared at it longer than necessary, as if by looking long enough it might turn into a complete explanation. The paper was thin, but felt heavy in his hand. Mike spoke very softly. "Thank you. Don't tell anyone." The neighbor nodded, tugged the dog along, and walked on without asking anything else. Mike stood still, watching until the man turned onto another street. After dropping Emma off at school, Mike drove straight to the police station. On the passenger seat, his phone was already open to the doorbell camera video, the small piece of paper neatly tucked into his wallet. The parking lot in front of the station was not crowded. Mike shut off the engine, sat for a moment, took a deep breath, and then stepped out. Inside, the space was bright, the familiar smell of paperwork and coffee in the air. A desk officer looked up as Mike approached. Mike laid everything out, from the video of the man standing under the streetlight to the sedan following him, the messages he had received. He placed his phone on the desk, played the video, and handed over the paper. Two officers stood watching, exchanged brief looks. One of them shook his head, his tone measured. "Two characters aren't enough to trace it. You need the full plate." Mike clenched his jaw, his voice dropping. "Enough for them to take my daughter." "Then what?" The officer met his eyes, did not look away, but did not change his tone. "We understand you're worried. We'll log it, we'll increase patrols, but right now, there's no basis to detain anyone." Mike left the station with a deeper sense of emptiness than he had felt the night before. Outside, the sky was still gray, a light rain falling again. He sat in the car, hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield for a few seconds before starting the engine. The law had listened to him, had recorded it, but it moved at its own pace, far slower than the fear growing inside him. On the drive back, one thought became clear. "I need a lawyer." Mike was not used to legal disputes, but he knew enough to understand that the name Hayes and that trust fund were not small matters. He took out his phone and called an acquaintance who had helped him with some paperwork after his wife died. It rang several times before someone answered. Mike introduced himself quickly, said he was in trouble, and that it involved a trust fund. There was silence on the other end. It lasted longer than normal, long enough for Mike to hear the steady breathing of the man listening. "Which trust fund?" the man asked slowly. "Hayes," Mike replied. "The Hayes real estate family." Silence again, heavier this time. Then the voice dropped. "Mike, listen to me. Don't get in too deep." Mike tightened his grip on the phone. "What are you talking about? I'm being threatened. My daughter is—" He did not finish the sentence before the man cut in. "I don't want my name tied to this." The voice was not raised, but it was firm. The call ended immediately, without a goodbye. Mike lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen. He stood in the parking lot of a shopping center, surrounded by other cars coming and going as usual. Everything kept moving like any other day, but he felt as if he had just been pushed out of a safe circle. The person he thought would help had stepped back the moment he heard the name, not because Mike had said something wrong, but because that name alone was enough to make people turn away. Mike stood there a moment longer, the phone still pressed to his ear, as if he had not yet accepted that the call was over. He understood something that had only now become clear. The people watching him were dangerous, but they were not the only ones backing away. Even those who should have stood on his side were retreating, one by one, before this ever reached them. He slipped the phone into his pocket and returned to the car. When he closed the door, the sound rang hollow in a way it usually did not. Mike sat in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, hands on the steering wheel, but not starting the engine right away. For the first time since everything began, he felt truly alone, one step behind the people watching him. The morning began with a very small misalignment. Mike opened the door and stepped into the front yard, car keys in hand, his head still heavy from lack of sleep. The rain had just stopped, the road was still wet, and the air was colder than usual. He walked toward his familiar car, bent to open the door, then noticed the car sitting unusually low. Mike stopped and looked down at the rear tire. It was completely flat, pressed tight against the pavement. Thin cut ran across the sidewall, neat and precise, like a razor line. Mike crouched and touched it, dirty water and rubber sticking to his fingertips. The cut was not deep, but it was enough to make the tire unusable. He stood still for a few seconds, looking at his hand, then looking around the street. Everything was quiet. No one stood on their porch. There were no strange sounds, just a small incident, if seen on its own. Mike straightened up, took a deep breath, and tried to keep his breathing steady. Emma appeared in the doorway, backpack on her shoulders, hair still slightly messy from sleep. She looked at the car, then at her father. "Dad, we're going to be late for school." Mike turned back, forcing the corners of his mouth up. "It's okay, I can handle it." He said it, but Emma still saw the red eyes from lack of sleep, the dark circles not yet hidden. She nodded and said nothing more, but stayed in the doorway longer than usual. Mike called a ride service. While waiting, he stood with Emma on the porch, his eyes constantly flicking toward the end of the street. Every passing car made his shoulders tense. Emma followed that gaze, lowering her voice. "Dad, why do you look like you're scared of someone?" Mike answered almost reflexively, his voice sharp. "Can you be quiet for a bit?" The words came out faster than he meant them to. Emma froze. She turned her face away, bit her lip, her hands tightening around her backpack straps. Mike saw her reaction, but said nothing more. An apology required emotional space he no longer had. The ride arrived. Mike opened the door for Emma to sit in the back, then took the front seat. During the entire drive to school, he barely spoke. Emma leaned back, looking out the window, her gaze quieter than usual. When the car stopped at the school gate, Mike turned around. "I'll pick you up this afternoon." Emma nodded and got out of the car without looking back at him. Mike returned home in another ride. The house felt emptier without Emma's presence. He walked around once, checking the locks, the windows, and the back fence. Everything was still in place, but the feeling of being watched did not leave. He opened his laptop and continued searching for the Hayes family and the woman from the park. One article called her a victim cut off from her family, and another hinted that she once controlled her father's assets. Each new page contradicted the last. Mike read, noted a few names, facts, then stopped and closed his eyes. "Any truth can be a trap," he muttered hoarsely. By late afternoon, light rain returned. Mike called a mechanic, but was given an appointment for the next day. He accepted that he would have to rely on ride services again. When he picked Emma up, he tried to speak more normally, asking about class and homework. Emma answered, but the distance remained, thin but clear. Mike noticed it, but did not know how to close it right now. That evening, Mike cooked in silence. Emma ate more slowly than usual, occasionally glancing toward the window, when she heard cars passing outside. After dinner, Mike checked the locks once more, then stood behind the glass door looking out. Cars passing unusually slowly in the rain kept his eyes fixed on the street. Night fell. Traffic thinned out, but whenever a car went by, Mike's body tensed. He stood behind the door, hand gripping the lock bolt, feeling as if that cold metal was the only boundary between him and everything pressing in. In the bedroom, Emma shifted many times. She did not sleep deeply, startled easily by very small sounds. Mike heard it, but did not go in. He was afraid that if he spoke, his voice would shake. Near midnight, Mike's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Sign it. Give it back. Don't make this hard." Mike stared at the words for a long time. He called back immediately. The call did not connect. An automated voice announced that the number did not exist. Mike lowered the phone, his palms cold. The message felt like a reminder that every step he took was being watched, that his hesitation was being noted. He stepped out the back door and opened it slightly. The rain had fully stopped, but the tiles were still wet. The backyard light cast enough glow to clearly see the ground. Mike bent down. On the tiles were fresh shoe prints, the tread pattern clearly visible, leading straight toward Emma's bedroom window. The footprints did not overlap and were not hurried. They stood there, like a silent instruction. Mike straightened up and followed the direction of the prints with his eyes. Emma's window was dark, the curtains fully drawn. He closed the back door very slowly, locked it carefully, then leaned against it for a few seconds. His breathing was heavy and short. What was happening was not meant to kill him right away. It was designed to grind down each rhythm of life, each reflex, each smallest reserve of patience. Mike understood that when he thought of the cut tire, Emma's frightened eyes that morning, and the fresh footprints outside, he went back into the house, climbed the stairs, and stopped in front of Emma's door. He placed his hand on the doorknob, but did not open it. After a moment, he turned away, walked to his own room, and closed the door behind him. In the darkness, Mike sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, realizing that his life was being guided inch by inch, and he had not yet found a way to stop it. That afternoon, Mike arrived at the school earlier than usual. He parked in his familiar spot, shut off the engine, and sat still for a few seconds before getting out. The air was still damp after the midday rain, the smell of wet grass drifting on the wind. Parents stood scattered near the gate, speaking softly, checking their phones. Mike looked around with the new habit he had formed, scanning every face, every car. Nothing stood out. When Emma appeared, her backpack slipping off one shoulder, he tried to pull his voice back into a normal rhythm. "What did you learn today?" Emma walked over and stopped by the car door. She answered very quietly, not looking at him. "I don't like it when you yell at me anymore." The short sentence carried no accusation, but it struck straight into Mike's chest. He paused for a beat, opened the door for her, and said softly, "I'm sorry." Emma did not reply. She just got into the back seat and buckled her seatbelt. The car pulled away from the school gate. Mike focused on the road, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Just a few hundred meters later, his eyes caught a familiar shape in the rearview mirror. The black sedan. It did not rush up, did not crowd him. It kept a distance that was careful enough not to draw attention from others, but close enough that Mike could not forget it. He tried to keep a steady speed. The car stayed there. Mike swallowed, forcing his voice to stay even. Emma looked out the window, then glanced behind them. "Is that car following us, Dad?" Mike answered immediately, too quickly. "No, sit still." He turned left at the next intersection. The sedan turned left as well. Not slow, not fast. Mike turned right at the following street. The car behind turned right too. Sweat began to soak the back of his shirt. Mike tried a slight acceleration, then slowed down. The distance behind him did not change. He checked the mirror, trying to find a face, any unusual movement. The tinted glass reflected the streetlights that had already come on. Emma gripped her seatbelt, her voice shaking. "Dad." Mike did not answer. He knew that if he spoke more, his voice would give him away. The road ahead led into a quieter residential stretch. Fewer shops, fewer people. Mike weighed his options, turn around or keep going. Just as he decided to turn into a narrower side street, a sharp explosion rang out. It did not hit the car, did not strike metal, but detonated near the curb ahead, close to the wheels. A blast of pressure threw water, dust, and debris into the air. Mike jerked the steering wheel by reflex. Emma screamed, the sound tearing through the cabin. Mike slammed the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet road before stopping. He did not think further. Mike twisted back, yanked the door open. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw. Emma jumped out, her feet barely steady on the ground. Mike grabbed her hand and pulled her across the road, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. The car behind them stopped. A door opened, then closed. Mike did not look back. He only knew they had to get away from that open stretch as fast as possible. They ran into a nearby park. The trees were dense, the paths narrow, the lights blocked by leaves. The ground was slick, Emma's shoes slipping for a beat. Mike held her hand tightly, dragging her deeper in. Behind them, footsteps sounded, steady, unhurried. There was no shouting, no running. The sound was like someone taking an evening walk, confident the distance would close on its own. Mike stopped behind a large planter and pulled Emma down low. He pressed her to his chest, clearly feeling her heart racing. Emma sobbed softly, her hands clutching his shirt. "Dad, I'm scared." Mike bent close to her ear, his voice breaking. "Don't cry. Don't let them hear." He covered her mouth with his hand, not forcefully, just enough to dull the sound. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness ahead, trying to separate movement from tree trunks and shadows. The footsteps stopped a few meters away. Mike held his breath. A figure stood there, not rushing forward, not drawing a weapon. Distant light was enough to reveal an upright posture, arms hanging loose. A man's voice carried over, low and cold, like a private conversation. "Mike, make this easy. We only need what belongs to Hayes." The voice did not threaten outright, did not rise. It carried the certainty of someone who believed he held the advantage. Mike tightened his grip around Emma, his back rigid. He did not respond. In his mind, the fragments aligned quickly. The sedan kept just the right distance. The explosion was timed precisely, and the park entrance where cameras were blocked. This was not impulsive. It was calculated to force him out of the car, force him to run, force him to expose himself in a space they controlled. The figure ahead did not move closer. Other footsteps sounded from another direction, farther off, as if sealing exits. Mike felt exhaustion beginning to weigh down on him. Running further meant revealing their direction. Staying meant waiting for them to advance. He looked down at Emma, saw her eyes wide with fear, tears blurring her lashes. Mike pressed his forehead lightly to her hair, trying to keep his breathing steady. The sounds of the park became unnaturally sharp. Wet leaves brushing together, water dripping from branches, the sound of his own breath. The man's voice came again, a little closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." The sentence held no irritation, more like an observation. Mike swallowed. He did not speak, but his mind raced. They did not want to kill him. If they had, the explosion would have been different. They wanted him to understand that his options were shrinking. They believed he would tire, would make a mistake, would open the door himself. That thought made his grip tighten. Mike glanced to the right, where a narrow path led toward an open, grassy area. He measured each breath, each next step, knowing any choice would leave a trace. Emma trembled in his arms. Mike whispered very softly, just enough for her to hear. "Listen to me. When I say run, you run straight. Don't look back." Emma nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, but no sound. Escaped Mike took a deep breath and lifted himself halfway up, his eyes still locked on the figure ahead. The man's voice came again, calm. "Mike, we don't have all night." The distance seemed to shorten, even though the figure did not move. Mike understood that time itself was being used as another weapon. He felt his heart hammering, his lungs filling tight. The trees around them stood still, blocking the light, turning the park into a separate pocket of darkness, cut off from the neighborhood beyond. Mike pulled Emma closer, ready for another dash, or for a confrontation whose ending he could not yet see. The footsteps behind them sounded again, steady and sure. No one was in a hurry. They believed he would be the one to run out first. Mike did not remember exactly how they escaped the park. Everything happened in a chain of short, urgent decisions. Cutting through a dirt path, crossing a wet patch of grass, slipping past a low fence behind a residential block. When the streetlights appeared again, his lungs burned, his hands numb from gripping Emma for too long. He did not stop to look behind him. He only knew they needed a place with people, as many people as possible. The supermarket sign glowed at the end of the block, cold white lights spilling onto the rain-soaked parking lot. Mike almost dragged Emma through the automatic entrance. The glass doors slid apart, the chime rang out amid voices and the clatter of shopping carts. He breathed hard, the words spilling out like self-reassurance. "It's crowded here. They won't dare do anything." Emma clung to his hand, her fingers cold and wet. Her eyes were red, darting through the chaos of lights. "Dad, can we go home now?" Mike shook his head without looking at her. In a bit, cold air from the ventilation system raised goosebumps on Mike's skin. The smell of fresh bread, produce, and cleaning chemicals blended. He pushed an empty cart, not to buy anything, but to have something between Emma and the rest of the world. They moved deeper inside, merging with the stream of late shoppers. Mike looked around, trying to catch someone's eye, a sign of concern, a question. There was nothing. Adults focused on shopping lists, children begged for candy, and employees restocked shelves. No one looked at them for more than a second. No one noticed that two people had just run from a pursuit. Emma stayed close to her father, her small steps uneven. Mike felt her body tremble slightly whenever someone passed too close. He bent down and spoke softly. "Stay close to me." Emma nodded, but her eyes kept scanning. The supermarket was crowded, but it did not feel safe the way he had imagined. It felt neutral, a place where everything happened side by side without touching. The loudspeaker crackled overhead, an employee reading promotions through light static. Mike let out a long breath he did not realize he had been holding. He thought about calling the police again, about staying here until closing time. The cart rolled slowly over the floor, wheels rattling. Mike turned into the canned goods aisle, hoping the tall shelves would hide them. The loudspeaker sounded again, clearer this time. Mike almost ignored I until a familiar syllable cut through. "Mike Carter." The female voice was distorted by the system, but the pronunciation was unmistakable. Mike froze. The cart wheels stopped completely. The surrounding noise seemed to pull back for a beat. His heart pounded so hard, his ears rang. Emma looked up at him, her voice shaking. "Who are they calling, Dad?" Mike did not answer. His hand clenched the cart handle until his knuckles went white. He looked around on instinct, searching for a familiar face, someone watching them. There was no one. People kept choosing items, pushing carts, and talking. No one reacted to the name that had just been spoken. The announcement continued, slower, as if deliberately enunciating every word. "We just want to talk about Emma." Her name echoed nakedly in the crowded space, without direct threat. It was enough to make Emma go rigid. She pulled her hand free, eyes wide with panic. "Dad!" Then she broke into a run, slipping between two carts. "Emma!" Mike shouted, his voice rising higher than he wanted. He abandoned the cart and chased after her. The crowd became an obstacle. He apologized, squeezed past, and reached out, but missed. Emma ran without direction, only trying to get away from the sound that had called her name. Mike felt eyes starting to turn toward them, not from danger, but from disruption. He caught her arm near the dairy section and yanked her back to him. Emma burst into tears, sharp and high. "I'm scared." Mike bent down and held her tightly. But in that instant he understood he had done the worst thing possible. He had exposed their position. Without touching, without appearing, they had made him the center of the room. A young employee nearby looked at them, uneasy. "Sir, are you okay?" Mike looked up, forcing his breathing steady. "We're fine. My daughter is tired." He pulled Emma up, trying to walk normally. But the feeling of being watched did not fade. It spread through the space, invisible, as if someone were standing at a higher point, seeing everything. The loudspeaker went silent. That silence was worse. Mike pulled Emma deeper inside, turning into the frozen food section where the hum of machines masked sound. He whispered into her ear, "Listen to me. We're heading for the back exit." Emma nodded repeatedly, her tears soaking into Mike's collar. He walked fast, but did not run. Each step felt heavy. He did not dare look back. In his mind, what had just happened settled into a cold conclusion. The crowds did not protect. The law was too slow. Public space was no longer safe. They did not need to be close. They only needed to say the right name. When Mike saw the emergency exit sign at the far end of the store, his heart sped up. He tightened his grip on Emma's hand, preparing for the final turn. At that moment, a voice called from behind them, not over the speakers, not distorted. "Mike!" A woman's voice, very close. Mike froze for half a second, long enough to realize he had just made another mistake. Mike pulled Emma sharply into a long aisle where boxes were stacked high, nearly reaching the ceiling. The fluorescent lights above made everything look flat and cold. He crouched slightly, placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, keeping both of them out of the main walkway. Emma trembled violently, her breathing rapid, tears spilling out uncontrollably. "Dad, I'm scared." The words broke through the supermarket noise, but Mike pulled her closer, covered her ear with one hand, his eyes fixed on the open space ahead. The surrounding sounds continued as if nothing had happened. Shopping carts rolled by, shoes scuffed the floor, and the air conditioning hummed. Mike tried to take deep breaths to steady himself, but his chest felt tightly bound. He lifted his gaze and looked down the length of the aisle, searching for an exit, a gap where he could move Emma without crossing the crowd again. At the end of the aisle, between two shelves, a figure stood still. Mike recognized her instantly, before his reason could react. A dark, worn coat, narrow shoulders, a pale face drained of color, not an image on a screen, not a blurred memory in the rain. It was her, the woman from the park. Her eyes were fixed on Mike, unblinking, unavoidable. The look did not beg, did not challenge. It hung there like an unanswered question. Mike went rigid. In that moment, everything around him seemed to slow. He heard each beat of his own heart, heard Emma's broken breathing behind him. She stood there without stepping forward, without retreating. She kept a distance just enough for Mike to see her, just enough for others not to notice, as if she understood exactly where she belonged in this room. A security guard pushed a patrol cart along the main aisle, his eyes sweeping quickly over the shelves. Mike saw him, saw the radio clipped to his shoulder, saw the employee badge on his chest. Mike's mouth opened by reflex, his voice catching in his throat. "Hey, He did not finish. One more word, one hand movement, a single point in her direction. That was all it would take for everything to end right here. In Mike's mind, images connected without order. Police, a precinct, a brightly lit interrogation room, a lawyer sitting across from him, calmly explaining rights, nights of sleep without jolting awake at the sound of cars outside. Emma is going to school on time, smiling again, no longer staring at the window every evening, a life returning to its old rhythm, even if it had to pass through something dirty. He looked at Emma. She was curled behind him, both hands gripping his shirt, eyes red and swollen. She did not see the woman at the end of the aisle, but she felt the tension in her father's body. Mike looked back at the woman. She was still there, unmoving. When their eyes met, she shook her head very slightly, almost unnoticeable unless one was watching closely. Her lips moved. Don't. Just one word. No volume, no force. Mike understood what she was doing. She was not asking him to save her. She was reminding him that once he spoke, there was no way back. Not for her, but for him and Emma. Behind them, a shopping cart struck a shelf hard. The metal clanged sharply. Emma jolted and screamed, the sound high and piercing. Mike spun around on instinct, pulling her tight against his chest. "It's okay. It's okay," he whispered, even though he did not believe it himself. Another woman apologized, dragged her cart away, unaware of what had just happened. When Mike turned back, the aisle ahead was empty. The woman was gone. No hurried footsteps, no sign of retreat, only the space between the shelves, light reflecting off the polished floor. Mike stood still, as a hollow feeling spread through his chest. He knew exactly what had just happened. He had been given a way out, and he had not taken it. Part of him exhaled in relief, as if he had avoided an act he would regret for the rest of his life. Another part tightened, because he knew the cost of that choice would not come immediately. It would arrive later, in other forms, other situations, when he would not have as many options as he did now. Mike pulled Emma away from the aisle, walking faster, but not running. He did not dare look back. In his mind, the word "don't" echoed, not as a plea, but as a cold reminder of a boundary he had just chosen not to cross. He did not know if he had done right or wrong. He only knew he had done what he could live with, at least for now. Emma was still crying, the sobs fading into broken hiccups. Mike bent down and spoke close to her ear. "I'm here." Those 3 words were all he could say without feeling false. He felt her body shake, then slowly begin to calm, as he held her tightly. The supermarket loudspeaker sounded somewhere farther away, announcing that closing time was approaching. Everything resumed its own rhythm. Mike looked toward the main aisle where people continued to move. No one knew that a moment had just passed in which a decision could have changed the course of several lives. Mike knew that if he turned back now, if he ran after the woman and called her name, he could still change something. But his feet did not move. He kept Emma close and guided her toward the emergency exit, where a green light blinked overhead. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the clear awareness that he had just cut off a path. As they turned past the final aisle, Mike glanced back once, very quickly, like a delayed reflex. There was nothing there except straight rows of shelves. The woman had merged into the crowd or into some space between aisles. She left behind a question that Mike knew would follow him for a long time, even if he could not put it into words. He bent down and lifted Emma into his arms, ignoring the curious looks around them. In his mind, one thought sharpened, cold, and unavoidable. These people did not need to touch him to control his choices. They only needed to place him in the right moment, then let him decide. And he had just decided. Mike carried Emma out of the supermarket through a side exit, where the fluorescent light faded, and the noise inside was sealed behind a metal door. The air in the parking lot was cold and damp, carrying the smell of wet asphalt after rain. Emma wrapped her arms around her father's neck, her face pressed into his shoulder, her body still shuddering in small waves. Mike walked quickly toward the car, head lowered, eyes constantly scanning around, as if the empty lot could produce something at any moment. He set Emma into the back seat, closed the door, and then moved around to the driver's seat. His hands shook so badly that the key slipped from the ignition the first time. Mike took a deep breath and tried again. The key went in, but his hand was still unsteady. Cold sweat dampened his palms despite the chill. He glanced at the rearview mirror and saw rows of parked cars, scattered headlights turning on and off. No black sedan appeared, but its absence brought no relief. His phone vibrated just as the engine started. Mike looked at the screen. An unknown number. His chest tightened. He hesitated for a very brief moment, then answered, his voice hard and sharp. "What do you want from me now?" There was no pause on the other end this time. The woman's voice came immediately, breaking and trembling, no longer hiding anything. "I thought they would only use the law. I didn't think they would go this far." Mike clenched his jaw, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. "You dragged my child into this," he said, each word dropping heavily, no attempt at calm. In the rearview mirror, Emma lifted her head, eyes red, looking at him through the gap between the seats. Mike reached one hand back and rested it lightly on her head by reflex, without turning around. On the other end, the woman sucked in a sharp breath, then sobbed. "I just needed them to show themselves. I needed proof." The words came out like a belated defense. Mike let out a dry, brief laugh. "And I was the bait?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. Silence stretched for several seconds. Mike could hear the broken breathing on the other end, even the sound of wind passing somewhere, as if the woman were standing outside. Then, her voice returned, lower and more exhausted. "If I really die, your daughter will be safer." The sentence held no drama. It was spoken like a conclusion, long considered. A chill ran down Mike's spine. He did not answer right away. Images interwove in his mind at speed. The woman sitting under the tree, the food box trembling in her hands, notarized documents, the trust fund, threatening messages, the explosion on the road, the voice in the park. Everything aligned into a clear line. This woman had never been in control the way he once thought. She had only lit the fire, then watched it spread beyond her reach. "You think sacrificing yourself ends this?" Mike said, his voice dropping, no longer harsh, but cold. "You think they'll stop?" On the other end, the woman did not answer immediately. She cried, small, broken sounds, as if held back for too long. "I don't have any choices left," she said, almost whispering. "I thought the law was strong enough." Mike stared straight ahead, the parking lot spreading out in front of him, white lines reflecting the lights. He realized something with sharp clarity. This was not a clash between a weak person and a fair system. This was a collision between people who believed they could manipulate a system by sacrificing others. And he had been pulled into the middle, not because he was clever or important, but because he was the most vulnerable. "You miscalculated," Mike said, slow and firm. "And now, my child is paying for it." On the other end, the woman stopped crying. Silence returned, heavier than before. Mike did not know what she was doing or where she was. He only knew that every answer had come too late. The call ended abruptly. Mike did not hang up. The phone screen went dark, leaving a faint ringing in his ears. He lowered his hand and set the phone on the seat beside him. He sat still in the parking lot, the engine running, but did not move. Emma shifted in the back. "Dad?" Mike turned his head and forced a smile. "I'm here." He drove out of the lot, slower than necessary. On the way home, streetlights stretched into blurred lines. Mike did not turn on the radio. The silence in the car was thick and heavy. Emma leaned her head against the window, eyes closed, exhausted from crying. Mike watched her in the mirror, his hand tightening on the wheel again. The woman's words kept echoing in his mind, not like a confession, but like a sentence passed on everyone involved. When they reached home, Mike stopped in front of the porch and did not get out right away. He sat for a while, looking at the dark house ahead. This house had once been enough, he believed, to shelter the two of them. Now it felt like a fixed point in a game whose rules had been bent from the start. Mike carried Emma inside, laid her on the bed, and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. She did not fully wake, only murmured a few indistinct words. Mike went to the living room and stood in the space. He opened his phone and checked the call history. The unknown number was gone. There was no trace to follow. He set the phone on the table and sat down, covering his face with both hands for a few seconds. When he lowered them, he did not cry. There was only a hollow feeling, cold and clear. He understood something that only now truly settled in. Some plans are built on the assumption that others will endure the damage instead. Some battles are started by people who will never be strong enough to see them through. That woman believed she could control everything through law and her own sacrifice. But she had misjudged her opponents, and worse, had pulled him and Emma into danger before realizing it. Mike stood up and went to check the locks, the windows, and each latch in turn. He did it slowly, like a ritual. When he returned to the living room, he looked up the stairs toward Emma's room. The door was slightly ajar, the nightlight casting a thin strip across the floor. Mike stood there for a long time, until the sound of a car engine outside faded away. In his mind, a clear understanding formed, cold and undeniable. This was no longer about a homeless woman, or a trust fund, or a wealthy family. It was a chain of wrong decisions built on other people's lives, and he was standing at the intersection of that chain, not as the one who chose the game, but as the one who was chosen. Mike turned off the living room light and climbed the stairs, each step heavier with added weight. He did not know how this would end. He only knew that, from the moment that call ended, he could no longer believe that the one who started the storm was still controlling it. Mike sat in the car for a long time, after leaving the supermarket parking lot. The engine kept idling, the dashboard lights casting a dull glow over his exhausted face. Emma had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head tilted to one side, her breathing no longer sharp like before. The tears on her cheeks had dried, leaving faint streaks behind. Mike reached back and pulled his thin jacket over Emma's shoulders, the movement slow and careful, as if touching any harder might cause everything to shatter. He looked at her through the rearview mirror, his throat tightening. "I'm sorry," Mike said very softly, almost only for himself to hear. The words were not aimed at a single mistake. They were meant for everything he had failed to control, for everything he had dragged his daughter into without any other way out. Mike turned off the engine, sat in the brief silence, then unlocked his phone. The screen lit up with familiar icons, call history, messages, and bank notifications. He opened the trust fund documents again, the files he had read over and over, but never like this. He scrolled slowly through the pages and stopped at the activation section. The date stood out clearly, matching the date listed as the woman's date of death. Mike leaned back in his seat and let out a long breath. The scattered pieces in his mind began to lock together in a cold order. Death was not the end. It was the switch. The trust was designed to activate when she was gone, to force the claimants to reveal themselves, to act. Mike whispered, his voice hoarse and tired. "You used the law to make them move." The sentence carried no judgment, only a late conclusion. He understood why everything had happened so fast. Why were the first steps, paperwork, lawyers, and bank transfers? And why, after that, Everything slid into dirtier moves. When the law was no longer enough to win, those people had chosen another way. Not to kill outright, but to crush the will of the person caught in between, to force him to withdraw. Mike's phone vibrated in his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. A message from an unknown number. Just one short sentence. "Where are you?" Mike stared at the words for a few seconds. No threat, no urgency. That calmness was what chilled him. He did not reply. His finger moved, deleting the message, then deleting the entire thread connected to that number. The screen returned to blank, as if the question had never existed. Mike started the engine and rolled slowly out of the parking lot. "Home," he said, not for Emma to hear, but to lock in a decision. The road back to the familiar suburbs stretched ahead, rows of low houses replacing commercial lights. Mike kept an even speed, not fast, not slow. He did not want attention, and he did not want to show how tense he was. Emma shifted in the back and opened her eyes halfway. "Dad," her voice was rough with exhaustion. "Dad, is it safe at home?" The question came lightly, but it weighed more than any threat. Mike did not answer right away. He watched the road, the streaks of light ahead. Then he said, slow and clear, "Nowhere is safe, but at home, I know where to run." Emma fell silent. She did not ask anything else. The answer did not comfort her, but it was the only truth Mike still had. The car kept moving, turning through familiar intersections. Each sign, each tree, each corner called back the old rhythm when going home meant the end of an ordinary day. Now, it was only the least bad option left. Mike thought of the woman in the park, of the fake death she had arranged. She believed the law was strong enough to force those people to play by the rules. She believed that once the light was turned on, everything would return to order. But the law was only a frame. When the stakes were high enough, that frame bent very quickly. Those who refused to lose found another path, and that path usually ran straight through people who had nothing to do with it. He also thought of the Hayes family, the name that kept appearing in documents, messages, and warnings from people who had once been willing to help him. A family rich enough to turn any dispute into a long game, powerful enough to make others afraid before being touched. Mike did not know how far they had gone in their internal war. He only knew he was standing at the edge, pulled in by one small act of kindness, then trapped between gears that were never his. The car turned into his neighborhood. Streetlights came on, yellow light spreading across the still damp road. Houses appeared, a few windows lit, silhouettes moving inside, muted everyday sounds leaking through glass. Mike slowed down, his tension not easing but changing shape. Being here did not mean safety. It only meant everything would now happen in a space he knew better. As the car rounded the final corner, headlights flared on behind him. Mike checked the rearview mirror. The black sedan appeared, unhurried, unsurprised. It kept the right distance, enough for him to see it, enough that he could not pretend it was not there. Mike tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw setting. He did not speed up or brake. He kept driving steadily, as if nothing had changed. Emma leaned against the seat, eyes open but unfocused. Mike did not turn to look at her. He knew one glance would break his composure. The sedan stayed in place, headlights fixed. No flashing, no pushing. It felt more like a reminder than a chase. Mike turned onto his street. White fences and familiar lawns slid by on either side. The sedan turned smoothly behind him, precise and clean. Mike's heartbeat slowed and grew heavy, each beat distinct. He understood that going home had not stopped anything. It had only moved the game to a different field, one where his only advantage was knowing every shadow and every exit. Mike slowed as he neared his house and checked the mirror again. The headlights behind him were still on, shining straight ahead without hiding. He took a deep breath and held the wheel steady. His house came into view, dark and quiet, waiting. He did not know what would come next, but he knew there was no way back. The sedan stayed close as Mike pulled toward the curb. Its headlights flooded his front yard, turning familiar darkness into a bare stage. Mike switched off his turn signal and kept his foot on the brake, the engine still running. He did not get out. In that moment, he realized the legal trap had done its job. It had forced those people into the open, but it had also released something else, something no longer bound by paperwork or law. The sedan stopped behind him, its engine rumbling softly. The headlights did not turn off. Mike rested his hand on the door handle, then stopped. He stared straight ahead at the closed front door of his house. In his mind, a clear thought formed, sharp and cold. When the law is used to open a door, what steps through is not always justice. He stayed where he was, caught between the glare of the headlights and the shadow of his home, knowing that from this moment on, every next move would fall outside the frame of anything he had once believed was safe. Mike sat for a few more seconds in the car after turning off the engine. The headlights behind him were still shining straight onto his front yard, turning the familiar space into a bare, exposed patch of light. He took a deep breath, then got out and opened the back door. Emma was more awake now, but still exhausted, stepping down with slow, heavy legs. Mike took her hand and led her up the porch steps. He did not look back at the sedan. Whether it was still there or had already left, it no longer changed anything. The keys rested in Mike's palm, the metal edges pressing into his skin. He held them tighter than necessary, as if they were the only thing he could use to defend himself. When he slid the key into the lock, his hand did not shake. The door opened, and the dark, silent house welcomed them with the familiar smell of wood and stale air. Mike stepped in first, pulled Emma close, and then closed the door behind them. He flipped on the living room light. The light flooded the room, revealing everything inside. The old sofa, the coffee table, the family photos on the wall, and the woman sitting there. She sat upright, hands resting on her knees, her worn coat still on. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, like someone who had not slept for many nights. When the light came on, she flinched slightly, but did not stand. Emma froze, just behind her father. She stepped back another pace, gripping Mike's shirt. "Dad? Who is she?" Emma's voice was small and trembling, carrying confusion more than pure fear. Mike did not answer right away. He stood in front of his daughter, his eyes never leaving the woman. She looked at Mike, her lips moving once before she finally spoke, her voice hoarse and tired. "I'm sorry." The two words dropped onto the floor like something heavy, going nowhere. Mike did not move closer. He kept his distance, his voice cold and direct. "Sorry doesn't protect my child." He spoke each word clearly, not loud, not shaking. The woman lowered her head. Her shoulders drew in slightly, as if absorbing a blow she had expected. "I needed them to come into the open," she said softly. "I had no other way." Mike looked at her, the exhaustion in his eyes undisguised. "You chose your path," he replied. "You had no right to drag my child with you. It's 9. Emma stood behind him, listening to every word without fully understanding. She only felt thick tension filling the room. Mike reached back and rested his hand lightly on her arm, signaling her to stay still. He looked back at the woman. "How did you get into my house?" She looked up, hesitated for a second. "The back door. I didn't break anything." The way she said it made Mike realize she had been here long enough to know the space, long enough to know when he might come home. "What were you planning to do when you came here?" Mike asked, his voice lower. The woman took a deep breath. "Wait for you. Tell you everything before they arrived." Mike gave a humorless smile. "You think you're still in time?" She did not answer immediately. Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the thin curtains were still drawn. At that moment, a sound came from outside. Tires screeched sharply on wet pavement, short and cutting. Mike turned his head by reflex, eyes toward the window. Headlights swept across the living room, cutting through the glass, slicing over the wall, and sliding across the floor. The light did not linger, but it lasted long enough to carve one truth deep. They were here. Emma tightened her grip on her father's hand. "Dad?" Mike did not turn to look at her. He clearly heard the engine outside, heard a car door open, and then shut. The woman sprang up from the sofa, her borrowed calm collapsing. "They're here," she said urgently. Mike shot her a look. Nothing left to hide. "You think I don't know?" Footsteps sounded on the porch. More than one person. Not rushed, not running. Steady, deliberate steps, like people who knew exactly where they were and what they had come to do. Mike guided Emma back another step, pressing her closer to the inner wall. He looked around the room, every familiar detail suddenly distant. The chair where he used to watch TV with Emma, and the corner of the table where she did her homework. Everything was now within the reach of the people outside. The woman stood a few steps from Mike, her hands visibly shaking. "I didn't think they would go this far," she said, almost pleading. Mike turned to her, his voice low but firm. "You were wrong from the beginning." He did not ask anything else. Every answer was pointless now. The headlights outside switched off, but the darkness did not fully return. The porch light came on, illuminating each drop of water on the steps. The footsteps stopped right at the door. A brief pause followed, long enough for Mike to hear his own breathing, to hear Emma swallow hard behind him. Then the knock came. Not frantic, not angry. 3 slow, even knocks, confident, as if the person knocking knew the door would open sooner or later. Mike stood still, his hand still gripping the keys. The woman looked at him, panic fully exposed. Emma clutched his shirt, silent, her whole body rigid. The knocking came again, the same rhythm, no harder than before. Outside, a man's voice rose, low and clear, cutting through the door. "Mike, we just want to talk." No direct threat, none was needed. The way he said Mike's name was enough to confirm they knew exactly who was standing behind the door. Mike did not answer. He looked down at Emma, then at the woman. In that brief moment, he understood with painful clarity that every clean option had been taken away long ago. The fake death had done its job. It had dragged those people out of the shadows. But once they were in the light, there was no reason for them to go back. The knock came a third time, still slow, still measured. The house seemed to tremble slightly with the sound. Mike straightened, placed one hand on Emma's shoulder as if to hold her in place. He faced the door and said nothing more. The room sank into a heavy waiting, where everything was set for the next step, even though no one inside still had control over it. Mike stood in the middle of the living room, feeling as if the familiar house had been twisted out of its original shape. The sofa, the coffee table, and the framed photos on the wall were all still there, but the distance between them seemed stretched, leaving a heavy void in the center of the room. Emma clutched his hand, her small fingers squeezing so hard that Mike could feel the tremor passing through her grip. Behind him, the woman stood pressed against the wall, shoulders drawn in, breathing fast and uneven, like an animal cornered with nowhere left to run. The knocking had just stopped, its echo still hanging in the air. Mike did not turn around. He stared straight at the wooden door in front of him, where the porch light spilled through the crack and formed a thin stripe of light across the floor. The woman stepped forward half a pace, her voice lowered until it nearly blended with her breathing. "If you hand me over, they'll stop." The words came out uncertain, as if she herself no longer fully believed them. Mike still did not turn. He answered slowly, his voice low and firm. "You don't know what they'll do to my child." There was no anger in the sentence, only a weariness that had gone too far to bother showing emotion. He did not need to look to know the woman was bowing her head now, her hands clenched in front of her chest, as if trying to hold on to a thought slipping out of reach. Outside, a brief silence passed. Then the knock came again, the second time, the same rhythm, no faster, no harder. A man's voice followed, deep and clear. "Mike, we just want to talk." The way he said Mike's name carried no direct threat. It sounded more like a statement, confirmation that they were here, that they knew he was listening. Mike felt his heartbeat clearly, no longer racing, but slow and heavy. In his mind, the choices did not appear as words, but as images. He imagined opening the door, stepping outside, pulling their attention toward himself, saying whatever was necessary to buy time. He saw himself standing under the porch light, hearing that voice continue, while behind him, Emma quietly slipped out the back door and ran to a neighbor's house. He saw the police arrive later, felt the cold cuffs around his wrists, and heard the same questions repeated in a bright interrogation room. He saw Emma safe, but carrying the image of her father being led away in front of her eyes. That image dissolved, replaced by another possibility. He imagined turning off the lights, staying silent, letting the house sink into darkness. No opening the door, no answering, waiting until the people outside grew tired and left, or chose another target. He saw himself and Emma sitting in the dark, listening to a car drive away, hearing silence return. He also saw the nights that followed, when Emma jolted awake at the smallest sounds, when she asked him about the woman who had stood in their living room that night, and he had no idea how to answer. Emma tugged gently at his hand. Mike bent down to look at her. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the dim light in the room, full of fear and expectation. "Dad, what do we do?" The question carried no pressure. It was simple, direct, the way a child believes adults have answers. Mike felt his throat tighten. He realized that whatever he chose would become part of Emma's memory, carried with her for years to come. Behind him, the woman drew in a shaky breath. "I'll go," she said quickly, as if afraid he would not hear. "You don't have to be involved. Just open the door." Mike closed his eyes for a very brief moment. When he opened them, he did not look at her. "You were involved the moment you walked into my house," he said, "and so was I." Wells. The knock came again, the third time. The rhythm did not change. 3 slow, solid knocks, enough to prove the patience of the person outside. Mike let go of Emma's hand, placed both hands on her shoulders, and bent down to her eye level. He did not offer familiar reassurances. He spoke only the truth, his voice low and clear. "Stand here. No matter what happens, don't move until I tell you." Emma nodded, lips pressed tight, tears welling but not falling. Mike straightened up. He felt a faint tremor in his legs, but his steps were steady. Each step toward the door was heavy, not with fear, but with the weight of knowing exactly what he was about to do. Behind him, the woman stepped back another pace, her back against the wall, as if she could not bring herself to follow him forward. Mike stopped in front of the door. His hand rested on the handle, the metal cold against his palm. He could hear his own breathing, hear even the smallest sound Emma made behind him. Outside, no more words were spoken. The people waiting believed this moment would come sooner or later. In that instant, Mike did not think about choosing right or wrong. He only knew he was choosing what he could live with afterward. The door in front of him was no longer just a physical boundary. It was where every path crossed, where every choice left a different kind of stain, none of them entirely clean. Mike tightened his grip on the handle and took one last deep breath. When the knock came again, he stepped forward. Mike's story is not about a good person being rewarded, but about the real cost of a kind act in an unfair world. One meal, one very small decision, pulled him and his daughter into a spiral of power, law, and violence that he never chose. The lesson is not, don't help others, but that kindness is not always protected, and sometimes it is exploited by systems far larger than any individual. The story also raises an uncomfortable question. When pushed to the edge, what do we protect first? What is right? What is safe? Or the memories our children will carry for the rest of their lives? There is no completely clean choice. Every decision leaves a mark, whether on legal records, in the mind, or in a child who grows up with that memory. This is not only the story of one father, but the story of anyone living in a society where law, money, and power do not operate for the sake of the vulnerable. If this story made you think, please share it so more people can learn from it. Thank you for following. We are committed to continuing to bring content that is thoughtful, honest, and deeply unsettling. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more powerful stories.